My name is Anne Whitaker and I'm based in Glasgow. I was raised in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, and I'm sure that the clear night skies that I could see when I was growing up had something to do with my ending up as an astrologer. As Hugh has said, I've written for all the major astrology journals, including the Mountain Astrologer, Del Horoscope, Astrodienst, and I've had a column in the Astrological Journal, the UK's Astrological Journal, which some of you will probably know about. And my column is called Not the Astrology Column. The reason for that is that the editor, Victor Oliver, who has a wonderful book of his own out just now called Chasing the Dragons, which is about the nodes and the draconic chart that arises from the nodes, he said to me, well, we're going to have an astrology column in the journal. So I said, okay, well, in the interest of balance, you need to have a Not the Astrology column. So there you go. So I've been doing Not the Astrology column for 7 years. And my background is in adult education and in social work, including psychiatric work. But about 1985, I decided I really needed to employ myself. So I've been self-employed since then as a counsellor, as a supervisor of students and colleagues, and also as a professional practicing astrologer. And I got my first certificate, my astrology certificate, from the Faculty of Astrological Studies by correspondence in 1983. And then I traveled up and down to the Centre for Psychological Astrology run by Liz Green and Charles Harvey during the 1990s. Had a wonderful time flying up and down to their seminars, got christened the Flying Scot, and I got my CPA diploma in 1998. So I've been a practitioner in Glasgow ever since. And now I've slowed down a bit because now I don't practice as an astrologer anymore, but I do mentor students across the world for the Mercury Internet School of Psychological Astrology, which is also related to the Centre for Psychological Astrology itself. And I have students from all over, and I really enjoy that. I also do quite a lot of writing. That's really my main preoccupation at the moment. Anyway, having said all of that by way of introduction, I am going to read you a couple of things from my book. The idea is that I'm going to read three of the essays, and that you can go and buy the book and read the 57 other ones yourselves if you want to. I thought it would be a nice idea to kick off by telling you about the 6 things I love about astrology. This was published in, I think it was it was written for World Astrology Day in March 2014, and I think it was published in the Mountain Astrologer blog. I can't quite remember. Anyway, here we go. 6 things I love about astrology. Here's a quote. 6,000 years ago, when the human mind was still half asleep, Chaldean priests were standing on their watchtowers, scanning the stars. And that's from The Sleepwalkers by Arthur Koestler. First thing I love. I love knowing that the rational, mythical, symbolic, and empirical art of astrology has been around for at least 6,000 years. Our increasing contemporary awareness of the interconnectedness of all things was well known in antiquity. The ancient maxim, as above, so below, still applies. Astrologers operate on the margins of our fragmenting reductionist culture, but we represent an unbroken line to a time which in many ways was wiser than ours is now. Being a tiny thread in that weave gives me a deep sense of pride, connectedness, and rootedness. Second thing I love. I love being able to look out at the night sky, seeing the beauty of the lunar cycle and the visible planets in their ever-changing, ever-repeating patterns, knowing that being an astrologer offers one the privilege of perceiving not only astronomy, but also symbolic meaning out there. I can still recall the exhilaration I felt on a freezing cold, clear night in January 1986 on a visit to the Outer Hebrides. My brother, a merchant navy captain, was able to point out Saturn to me, the first time I had ever seen that venerable planet with the naked eye. Saturn's meaning was also present that night. We were on our way back from the wake for an old uncle who had just died. The third thing I love about astrology. I love the fact that I started out as a dismisser of our ancient art and ended up its devoted practitioner, having set out to confront my embarrassment at the inexplicable fascination I had developed for a subject which I considered to be beneath my intellectual consideration. This is the typical position of ignorance combined with arrogance from which many people dismiss astrology, not realizing that there is a subject of great depth and power beyond the sun signs of astrology's public face. I embarked on a course of study with the Faculty of Astrological Studies in the early 1980s to prove to myself through study rather than ignorant dismissal that there was nothing in astrology, and have kept up an unbroken interest since then for nearly 40 years. The fourth thing I love about astrology. I love how literal astrology can be. Saturn met Neptune in November 1989, and the Berlin Wall came down. There was a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Libra in July 1969, when a huge cooperative effort of unique scientific endeavour put the first human on the moon. On the day Pluto first went into Sagittarius in January 1995, there was a massive earthquake in Japan, and the city of Kobe went up in flames. At that same time, John Paul II, the best travelled pope ever, preached to an open-air audience of over 1 million people in Manila, in the Philippines. To lower the tone somewhat, I was having lunch with a bank manager friend of mine on the day Saturn turned retrograde on my Scorpio IC on the 7th of March 1985. For no apparent reason, being sober at the time, I passed out, just as another bank manager and friend of my friend was passing the restaurant window. They both ended up carting me home between them. You couldn't make it up, could you? I love the impossibility of ever getting on top of or to the end of one's astrological studies. I have never applied myself to, for example, Chinese or Hindu astrology, not yet feeling I have enough of a grasp of the Western tradition into which I was born. And you can do hundreds or thousands of horoscope readings, teach hundreds of classes with thousands of students, and someone will still come up with a manifestation of, for example, Venus combined with Saturn or Mercury combined with Neptune, which you have never before come across or even thought of. And finally, the sixth thing I love about astrology. I love astrology for the help it has given me and countless other people who are willing to look within and try and be honest about themselves, in understanding the quirks and complexities, the gifts and pains of my personality and life pattern. My studies began as the next step in a lifelong quest to prove that our existence has some meaning, that we are not just butterflies randomly pinned to the board of fate, that we are each here because we have something unique to contribute to the big picture. Astrology has provided me with that proof. For that, and to that unbroken line of students and practitioners of our great art, stretching right back to those ancient Chaldeans on their watchtowers, I will be forever grateful. Thank you. Okay, I think I need a glass of water now. I hope you enjoyed that, and that's perhaps stimulated your own thoughts about the things that you really love about astrology. And if it has, it would be very nice to hear from you when we get to our question and answer and discussion session. Okay, are you sitting comfortably? Because this is going to be our somewhat longer piece. So if you're watching this on the recording, you can go and grab yourself a cup of tea and come back, or a glass of wine, of course, or anything you fancy. Okay, this is about prediction, but it's also about my personal story of how I encountered astrology. And I'm sure you'll agree when you've heard it that it's a pretty good story. Right, the introduction first. The question of whether it is possible to foretell the future is one which has preoccupied humans ever since we evolved into self-conscious beings and began to conceptualize past, present, and future, now thought to be around 80,000 years ago. Prediction has been around for a long time. Economists do it. Weather forecasters do it. Politicians do it. Physicists do it. Futurologists do it. Most of the foregoing predictors direct scorn and derision at the people who have done it for longer than anyone else, astrologers. There is several thousand years worth of recorded empirical evidence, much of it stored on clay tablets as yet undeciphered in the basements of museums across the world, demonstrating that the movements of the planets in our solar system correlate with particular shifts in, quote, the affairs of men. Shakespeare's term, not mine. What we can and cannot do. Both astrologers and astronomers via planetary observation can look at and correctly plot the unfolding pattern of energies through space-time. After that, astrologers step into a realm different from that of observation of the external material planetary world. By looking at a section of any point or moments of the past, present, or future via a horoscope, they can examine the essence of that moment in terms of its meaning and speculate with moderate accuracy about what some of the branches manifesting in the wider world or in individuals' lives may be. What they cannot do is see exactly and with consistency how these branches are going to manifest. Historically, our track record on hindsight is much better than it is on foresight. There have been some spectacularly accurate predictions made by astrologers in the public realm over the centuries. A famous one was made by Luc Gaudicus in 1555 to the effect that King Henry II of France, then aged 37, was in danger of death in his 42nd year by a head injury incurred in single combat in an enclosed space. And 5 years later, Henry duly died of a lance splinter which entered his eyes and pierced his brain. There have also been some spectacular failures. For example, to predict that the Munich Agreement of 1938 would lead to World War II. A new model slowly emerging. We do much better at describing the essence of a pattern, but identifying the exact branches is much more hit and miss. Personally, this cheers me, since it appears to suggest a creative balance between fate and free will in the universe. Chaos theory in contemporary physics also has strong parallels with the astrological paradigm. Both the language of astrology and the language of quantum physics tells us that not everything is pinned down. Indeed, a view and a model are slowly emerging despite considerable resistance from the die-hard defenders of reductionism, which can demonstrate convincingly that the lenses of astrology and quantum physics are focusing on the same underlying all-encompassing reality. The perspectives offered by contemporary writers, astrologers, depth psychologists, and scientists, such as Richard Tarnas, Liz Green, the late Charles Harvey, Stanislav Grof, physicist Brian Swimme, Rupert Sheldrake, and others, including recent books by astrologers Armand Diaz, Kieron LeGrice, and Bernadette Brady, have been of inestimable value to me. I urge any readers who are keen to expand their own perspectives to explore their work. Consciousness holds the key. My view based on personal experiences and those of clients and students over nearly 40 years, as well as extensive reading and study, is that the key dimension in determining how a particular planetary pattern will play out in a person's life is the level of consciousness at which they are operating at the time the inevitable challenges of life come their way. Most astrologers have had the humbling experience of looking at the horoscope of a client, which looks so difficult that the impending consultation feels very stressful. But upon encountering the client, they meet someone who has faced, dealt with, and grown through hard experiences that would have flattened a less aware person. We can never predict the level of awareness of a client we have never met, although we can have a good idea that, for example, Mars conjunct Saturn conjunct Pluto square the moon is going to be no walk in the park. I am personally very hesitant about both the accuracy and the wisdom of predicting at all, especially for individuals, in any more than a quote, describing the core and speculating about the branches, unquote, kind of way. Predicting that a specific branch will manifest may well close down possibilities rather than opening them up, which also takes us into the realm of self-fulfilling prophecy. For example, when Uranus was about to cross my Pisces descendant in 2005, beginning its 7 or so years traverse of my 7th house, I became concerned about what this might mean for my marriage. The rather problematic implications of Uranus' impact on the relationship realm that practicing astrologers see every day in their students' and clients' lives, as well as their own, worried me. However, a profound, totally unexpected spiritual experience on my husband's part linked both our spiritual journeys into walking the same path at the same time. This has had a supportive, deepening effect on our marriage, and not one I could possibly have envisaged before Uranus crossed my descendant. And I'm going to add a wee poster, not in the book, to this, which is from Liz Green herself, who once said in one of her seminars, if you think you can predict Uranus, it's not Uranus you're looking at. She was very good at gnomic comments like that. Now I'm going to have a little pause and get some more water before I tell you my own story, which I think you'll find interesting. And towards the end of it, I'm going to put up a couple of images, which I hope you will find inspiring. Okay, here we go. My personal prediction story and the Laundrette. Yes, the Laundrette. Having just made what I hope is a coherent case for specific prediction being a practice of dubious merit and only intermittent accuracy, here is my own striking experience of being on the receiving end of a specific prediction I never asked for at a time when I was a typical astrology dismisser. I considered that astrology was rubbish without ever having taken the trouble to study it. Bath, Somerset, England, June 1974. I was engrossed in the Sunday evening chore of doing washing in the Laundrette on the London road near where I lived. It was a liminal time in my life. After having resigned from a lecturing job, I was preparing to leave Bath. A return to the Outer Hebrides was imminent. A strange-looking couple came in, accompanied by a little girl of about 5 years old. The woman was tall, slender, with long dark hair, a very scruffy Afghan coat, and a distinct look of share. The man was smaller than she, slight, with unruly greying hair and a mischievous face. I carried on with my laundry. The little girl was chatty. Soon she was putting my money into the dryer for me. I was telling her stories, and we had become great friends. I met her parents. They were both artists and astrologers. Just a note here, I call them Seamus and Gloria. These are not their real names. Not the kind who do the stuff you see in the paper, said Seamus scornfully, having noted the fleeting look of disdain which crossed my face at the mention of the word astrology. I had given one of my mature students a very hard time a couple of years before for her public devotion to what seemed to me to be a subject unworthy of someone of her intelligence. Seamus said, "We are the real thing." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in their cramped basement kitchen, drinking tea and being charmed by Seamus. His combination of erudition, intensity, conviction, humour, and blarney was irresistible. "Do you know your birth time?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "Why are you interested in that?" "Because I am going to draw up your horoscope," he said. Whether I wanted such a procedure embarked upon or not was of no consequence to him. So slain was I by his charm that I didn't offer any resistance. As I watched, interested in spite of myself, Gloria and Seamus assembled a hefty tome, which those of you out there will recognize as an ephemeris, a slim pamphlet, blank sheets of paper, a calculator, a fountain pen, and a newly sharpened pencil. The tome was an ephemeris, they informed me, a list of the planets' placements every day at noon for the whole of the 20th century. Seamus took a blank sheet, carefully drawing a circle freehand in its centre. He then proceeded with great rapidity and fluency to insert squiggles, planets, and numbers around the edge of the circle, the inner edge of the circle. He then drew lines within a smaller inner circle, aspects or links between the planets at the time you were born. He and Gloria then sat back, gazing with silent preoccupation at the image they had created. Seamus, looking at his drawing and only briefly at me, gave an astonishingly accurate description of my father's complex, domineering, idiosyncratic, and wayward character. That was bad enough, not least because it reminded me of certain aspects of myself. Worse was to follow. "You're a person rich with creative gifts," he said, "but you need to know and face more clearly the more difficult facets of your own nature. It's time to do that, since you're approaching 30 and your Saturn return." With that, he forensically summed up those parts of myself, which I knew were there, but had tried very hard to avoid facing or admitting to anyone. A very common and human failing that Saturn transits expose and challenge on a cyclic basis throughout our lives. I was feeling by this time as though I'd been hit on the side of the head with a sock full of sand. Then, with true rhetorical skill, he delivered the punchline. "You tell me you are a total skeptic now," he said. "But stop fooling yourself. You have a deeply spiritual nature which needs to find meaning and connection with something greater than yourself. Until you manage that, you will be driven by the same restlessness that still drives your father, and you will not find inner peace." There was a long pause. "And I can see from where the planets will be in about 7 years' time that the big picture is going to come seriously calling at your door. In your early 30s, you're going to end up either doing what I'm doing now or something very like it." I was utterly shocked. I had known those people for less than an hour, most of which had been spent walking back from the Laundrette to their flat and organizing cups of tea. They knew nothing about me of any significance. How could they produce such specific and accurate material from marks on a piece of paper? I couldn't even begin to get my head round the prediction. It seemed beyond absurd. Slowly, I carried my laundry home. There was no way I could find to make sense of the experience I had just had. There was no file inside my head into which it could fit. Now, in a moment, I'm going to tell you what happened 7 years later but I thought you might like to see the chart that Seamus drew up for me. But first of all, I'm going to show you a picture of Seamus himself, because he was a very good artist and he drew this picture for me, and I have kept it ever since. So with a bit of luck, I'll be able to stop sharing this and bring up, first of all, the picture of Seamus. And then after that, the picture of the chart he drew. Here he is. That's Seamus, self-portrait. And now I'm going to show you the chart. You'll see a different version of my chart in the next part of this reading. But in the meantime, I'm just going to show you the picture he drew. It's got a bit scruffy over time because it's been traveling a lot since it was first drawn up. Here we are. There we go. My first horoscope, when I was still a dismissive skeptic, July 1974, Bath in England. And there you can see it. I have a lot of planets in the 12th house. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. By Placidus, Mercury, my ruling planet, is in the 11th, which is just as well for me. Virgo rising, part of fortune there, and all the other stuff. And the North Node exactly conjunct my midheaven. And of course, Mars conjunct Uranus in the 10th house, which is probably something to do with why I ended up as a self-employed astrologer. Okay, we'll continue, and then I'm going to show you the next image very soon. Okay, you ready for this? 7 years later. 7 years later, a friend gave me a copy of Alan Oken's Complete Astrologer. Alan Oken's Complete Astrology. I had no idea why, but had enough respect for that friend and his opinions to begin reading. About 3 pages in, I had the strangest sensation of someone pulling me into the book, saying, "Come here, you're for me." I still have this battered old copy with my signature on it, February 1981. And here I am going to put up the chart for February 1981 and talk about it a little. Voila. It's a bit scruffy looking, but what I've done is I've put my own chart. Of course, you know, we all calculate by computer now, but for the first 7 years that I practiced astrology, I didn't allow myself to get a computer. I drew them all up by hand. So there's the wheel. And as you can see, there are all these planets in the 11th and 12th houses. There's the node there. This chart, incidentally, is set for Glasgow, where I live, which has moved my MC slightly from 28 Taurus to 0 Gemini, and the IC to 0 Sagittarius, which is very fitting for all the teaching and lecturing I have done in the years that I've lived in the city of Glasgow, which is a very long time. So there we have the chart, and I'm going to talk through the various points of significance here, okay? Here we are. Right. As I said, I still have this battered old copy with my signature on it, February 1981. I can't remember the exact date in February 1981 when I started studying astrology, but as you have probably begun to pick up by now, there was a lot going on. My transit at the time, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Libra down here was exactly conjunct my natal second house Neptune and exactly sextile natal 11th house Mercury, my ruling planet. Uranus was crossing the natal IC and the south node. Neptune was beginning a long opposition. Where's Neptune? Neptune was beginning a long opposition to the natal 10th house Uranus-Mars conjunction. There we are. And was trining my natal 12th house sun. So Neptune and Sagittarius trine a natal 12th house sun would probably have been sufficient in itself, but there's all this other stuff going on. And then, of course, the North Node was conjunct, possibly the most significant of all these transits. The North Node, the pointer, the North Star, the pointer to one's future direction and purpose in life, sitting right there on Mercury-Pluto. And as I've said in this account here, a summons, pretty much. In February 1981, that prediction of Seamus's from 1974, which I had never quite forgotten, and the feeling of fascination, compulsion, and exhilaration, which Alan Oken's book triggered in me, came together in a way that has profoundly shaped the whole of my subsequent life. Alan Oken sadly has recently died. I wrote a tribute to him and told this story in the recent issue of the Astrological Journal. Here are my concluding thoughts on the subject of prediction. It's good for us all, especially people like me with 7 planets and fixed signs, to get jolted out of our positions now and then by experiences that don't fit our frames of reference. Hopefully, the jolt will have the effect of breaking down some of our old defenses and letting new experience and new knowledge enter our lives. I reinterpreted Seamus's prediction in the light of my own subsequent astrological knowledge. It was pretty obvious by then how he had got there, as was the timing of it, because he would have in 1974, as all practicing astrologers, he would have where the outer planets were, where they'd been and where they were headed in his head. So he would have been easily able to look at this chart in 1974 and think, okay, in about 7 years' time, she's going to have Uranus on her IC. And even if he had only registered that, that would have been enough to tell him that astrology was coming knocking on my door without any of the other transits. I still think about the encounter with him, his child and partner over 40 years later. Did his prediction at some subliminal level point my life in a direction that it would not otherwise have gone? I will never know. But I do know, as a result of our encounter, that whatever my reservations are about the wisdom of offering such specific outcomes to people, astrologers sometimes have the power to do just that. Whether they should do it is another issue altogether. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed that story. I certainly enjoy retelling it. Not everybody encounters astrology for the first time in a laundrette in a place called Bath, really. I mean, you couldn't make it up, could you? Right, I'm going to have another glass of water and then I'm going to embark on a very polite tackling of the dismissers, those who dismiss astrology as rubbish, who invariably know little or nothing about it. Okay, in a moment. I wish this was a big glass of wine, by the way. I'm beginning to feel the need for it. Cheers. Before I start reading this to you, I'm going to put up the cover of my book again, just in case anybody fancies going and buying it after this session. Hang on, let's just get this right. Nearly there. Here we are. Okay. Astrology is a lot of old rubbish. Please, not that tedious old trope again. I know it's not like me to rant. Those of you good folk who call by my blog regularly know that. However, I feel like a bit of a rant today. What about? Dismissers, that's what. Normally, I view this response to astrology with weary resignation. However, a recent airing of that tedious old astrology is a load of old rubbish trope really got under my skin. How I wish that people would spend some time in studying subjects which have been a vital part of human experience for thousands of years, rather than displaying their profound ignorance of those very subjects in the public realm. I know of what I speak, being a reformed dismisser myself. Readers of this blog, and those of you who are listening this evening, may recall the tale of my being stopped in my tracks by a startling prediction made as a result of an encounter with astrologers in a laundrette in Bath, England, that I would in fact become an astrologer too. You can find the full story in the fate section of this book. Moving from ignorant dismissal of a tradition going back at least 6,000 years to gradual acceptance of its validity based on study and experience was one of the most profound and humbling processes of my entire life. I used to like the word skeptical. For me, it meant not accepting anything on trust, but being prepared to consider the evidence, not just of accepted facts, but also of experiential evidence, which to me and much of the world's population, including open-minded scientists like Professor Bernard Carr, Professor of Mathematics and Astronomy at London University, and a past president of the Society for Psychical Research, can have its own validity. In a lecture some years ago, Professor Carr stated that there is a barrier which needs to be overcome between science and the rest. Those who consider only experimental evidence to be valid, i.e., conducted under strict laboratory conditions, clash with others who find well-researched experiential evidence to be of at least equal worth. I think he is absolutely right. Unfortunately, the term skeptical has now largely narrowed down to mean dismissing any body of knowledge, experience, or practice which does not fall within the narrow terms of reference of reductionist scientific procedures. Astrology has never delivered terribly convincingly when subjected to scientific approaches. Personally, I've not been the least surprised or upset by this. One cannot expect applying the procedures of one model of reality, say reductionist science, to the practices of another, astrology, to produce much by way of validation. My lifelong interest in science has not been diminished by the depressingly dominant reductionism of our era. A long-term preoccupation has been to bring together in my own mind contemporary insights flowing from the weird world of quantum physics with the ancient wisdom traditions and symbol systems centered around the perennial philosophy, including astrology. The book Cosmos, Chaosmos, and Astrology by Dr. Bernadette Brady has especially aided me recently. It's a book I have now read several times, and I'll put the cover up after I've finished reading this so that you can see it. Her highly stimulating rethink of the nature of astrology, taking us on an erudite journey from ancient myth to modern chaos and complexity theory, provides a convincing set of reasons why astrology, despite the increasingly dominant reductionism of 21st century culture, remains a lens of great value to look through in making sense of life. Even if, to quote Brady, the real result of 80 years of research into the possibility of astrology being a science is the evidence that it is not. It belongs, Brady believes, to, quote, another worldview. She offers us astrologer and authors Gary Phillipson's opinion that astrology may work best when approached and practiced as a sacred art. From my own experience, I would agree with this. I heartily recommend Dr. Brady's book to those of you who, like me, have respect for science when practiced in an open-minded way, but recognize that life offers more than one lens through which we may view the multifaceted reality of which we are privileged to be a part. As the atomic physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer so wisely put it, these two ways of thinking, the ways of time and history and the way of eternity and timelessness, are both part of our efforts to comprehend the world in which we live. Neither is comprehended in the other or reducible to it. They are, as we have learned to say in physics, complementary views, each supplementing the other, neither telling the whole story. In the end, we astrologers have each to find our own way of living with the dismissers. Maintaining both breadth and depth of study while striving for a high standard of professionalism in our teaching and practice is the most effective rebuttal of this type of ignorance. Having occupied more than one profession during my working lifetime, I have always found that integrity of action speaks much louder than any words can, although of course the latter have their place. Let the dismissers get on with being ill-informed and narrow-minded. Let us simply get on with our work. Shall I just put up the cover of Bernadette Brady's book for a minute? Here we go. Cosmos, Chaosmos and Astrology, Rethinking the Future of Astrology by Bernadette Brady, published by the Sophia Center and available on Amazon. And really, it's quite a short book, quite condensed, but I've reread that about 3 or 4 times because it really is worth dipping into and reflecting upon. And I think she does a great job of pulling quantum physics and the imagery of astrology and the symbolism of astrology together. Okay, I'm now going to put my cover back up again so nobody can say they haven't seen it. Oh no, I mean, in the book, I have quite a few pieces on mundane astrology, because one of my special interests is actually in the big planetary cycles. So the last essay in the whole lot is about what's been happening since the 18th century in terms of the great shift from the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions going right through the Earth element, which took from about 1803 to the winter solstice of 2020, can you believe, when the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction met it at 0 degrees of Aquarius, pointing us in the direction of a 200-year era of the air element. At the time when our world had just been upended by an airborne virus, and we took to the air en masse through Zoom and other platforms. So really, the big planetary cycles are just as interesting to me in terms of what they can say about collective movements and history and culture as individual work is. And what I hope I've struck is the right balance between looking at individual life and sometimes giving quite a bit of personal memoir, but always setting what I have to say about individual life in the big picture. I hope that's a good enough response to your question, Brian. Yes, but what you lose, I mean, I'm quite Saturn Pluto. Fortunately for my students, friends, families, and associates, it's gentled by Neptune and cheered up by a big fat square from Jupiter to the third house. Otherwise, Saturn Pluto might be a bit grim. But I stuck to hand calculation for years. I wouldn't let myself use a computer. And then, of course, once you start using a computer, which I started doing at the end of the 1980s, then you never look back. But I still remember the slow process of gradually drawing up the chart and thinking, oh, that's interesting. The moon's in Scorpio, the sun's in Aquarius, and there's a bit of conflict going on there. And then by the time you'd drawn the whole list and I'd put them and were ready to put them up on the chart, you already had a sense of connection with the person whose chart you were drawing up. And that was quite a precious thing to lose in the process of being able to just press a button where you simply don't go through the same process and you have to make the connection with the other person in a different way. So I would never go back to hand calculation, having dragged myself out of it. But I do miss that. I do miss that sense of being able to make a connection in the slow process of putting the chart up. Yes, because that's what I've done that for years and years. I mean, even although, you know, I've used computers forever, really now it seems, I still, if I'm preparing somebody's chart, I put up a bi-wheel where I have the natal chart in the middle, the progressions, which I absolutely love and think are wonderful and so helpful, in the outer rim. And then I take my color pens and I put the transits and the nodes and all that on the outer rim in my own hand style, which, as you've seen, is a bit rough and ready still, but it brings the whole thing to life and brings a personal dimension to it. And then what I do is I take highlighters and I highlight everything that's linked in. Like, for example, if you have the progressed moon, say at 17 of Taurus, then you're going to have Uranus by transit sitting right on top of that with the nodes coming up, and highlighting that makes you realize that the person's process has unfolded to this point, and Uranus and the nodes is going to bring out events that are going to challenge you to move on in your own life process. So I think you can use both technical pressing the button skills, and you can also use your ordinary manual skills with color. I'm a great believer in using color because that really brings the whole thing into perspective and helps you. I mean, I'm quite spatially dyslexic. So I was telling Hugh beforehand, I suffered greatly learning how to calculate because I'm not very good with spatial stuff. But I find that anything you can use to help you connect more vividly and more clearly to the person whose chart you're doing, you should do. So good for you, Susan. Good for you, Susan, that's what you do, because I think that's a really good method of going about things. Well, I hope you enjoy your second Saturn return, Susan, because I mean, my first Saturn return was fairly purgatorial, like it is for so many of us, but I really enjoyed my second Saturn return. I found it a very fulfilling and positive experience. So also there's in my book, I've had several things published about the cycles of Saturn. And they're in that book. I think the most recent one was an update of the piece I wrote in the 1990s for the Mountain Astrologer. And they asked me if I would do an update and a PS now that I was over my second Saturn return. So I did that. So you might find that quite interesting to read. What, do you know what? Can I just boil it down? I just think that Liz Green's work is, I'm interested in all dimensions of astrology, but I come from a background where Carl Jung has influenced my development as a person and as a practitioner, as a counselor, more than anyone else. So of course, that tells you that I'm most attracted to psychological astrology. And I had the great privilege of sitting in Liz's seminars for most of the 1990s. And I think she has done a whole series on, she and Howard Sosportis, who sadly died too soon, between them covered all the planets. They covered the sun and moon, Jupiter, Mercury, Venus and Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. They covered the whole lot between them. And Liz's book, if you want to really get into the depths of Pluto, for example, her The Astrology of Fate is unsurpassable, in my opinion. So Liz Green, Howard Sasportas, now who else? I really like Stephen Forrest as a contemporary astrologer. I mean, he was kind enough to write a lovely review of my book, because coincidentally, he had a book of essays came out around the same time as mine, called The Endless Sky, in which he covers his essays for about 20 years. So I really like his approach to astrology. And, you know, it's interesting how when you put in the spot, names desert you, because there are loads of other astrologers I have valued. I mean, Armand Diaz, who some of you may have heard of, an American astrologer, I really like his books. He wrote a book called Integral Astrology, which is very good. And Kieran Legrice, if you're interested in Eris, which is a planetoid that, or a minor planet that we're beginning to become more interested in. He's written a great book on that. And Richard Tarnas, of course, Cosmos and Psyche. That's quite a heavy read, but it really is worth grounding yourself in that, because it really helps you to get the bigger picture. And Stephen Arroyo, his book Astrology, Karma and Transformation was one of my formative books. And Alexander Ruperti, The Cycles of Becoming. I think that one has been republished not long ago, and it really is a marvelous book on the cycles. So no doubt I'll think of loads of other people when we go off, but these are the key people that come to my mind who have influenced me and fed my work. I loved Rincewind, I must say, and really, I love the idea of the 13th constellation. I missed that, and I must look that up actually, because he's obviously been influenced by astrology. Oh yes, and I mean, we all carry within us a sort of, at an unconscious level, a kind of archetypal patterns of life that we project onto the heavens, and we project onto various dimensions of our own experience. So no matter what planet you landed on, whether it was Planet Janet is one of my favorite planets, by the way. It's the one I've been on for most of today, as just about every technological thing that could go wrong has gone wrong today. So I'm astonished that we've managed to get to more or less the end of this session and we're all still here. I'm surprised that I haven't dragged you all away to Planet Janet with me, but no doubt if we were there, we would construct an astrology which was reflective of the place of that particular planet in whatever constellation or solar system we ended up in. It's our nature to seek pattern. We're pattern seekers. And that's why astrology came into being, because ancient humans stood and gazed at the stars and needed to make some sense out of it. Well, you'll find in the book that I have a section which is called Where I Live Behind the Sofa. And I have a lot of planets in the 12th house, although my ruling planet is Mercury, and all these planets are in Leo. So I have a considerable ambivalence as I get older about coming out and doing talks and lectures at all. I've been asked to do stuff quite a lot, and mostly I've said no. But various friends and colleagues are slowly hauling me out from behind the sofa. And if you publish a book, then you have to emerge from behind the sofa. This evening is evidence of that. So I may very well do a bit more over the next couple of years. I don't know. So watch this space. If you get my book, you'll find my email address in it. And you're more than welcome to get in touch with me, and I'll stick you on any mailing list I might be setting up. Okay. That's really interesting. That stellium follows in Scotland's chart's 12th house. It's midheaven. I think Pluto was going over. The referendum more or less occurred on Robert the Bruce's Pluto return over his midheaven, if I recall correctly. But it was cited by Jessica Adams as a striking prediction. Goodness, my good. Well, as you can gather, I have an English name, so I'm an internationalist despite being Scottish by birth. Right, what have I said here? Yeah. Oh yes, the Scottish Parliament. As the time of the elections approached, Jupiter crossed all the Aries planets at the top of Scotland's horoscope, as well as the MC. This is just a wee bit I'll read to you. During this period, since the sweeping New Labour victory in May 1997, a Scottish Parliament was made reality instead of a romantic nationalistic fantasy, with transiting Pluto in Sagittarius opposing Scotland's Jupiter in the 11th in Gemini, square the second house Virgo moon. Scotland's sun-moon midpoint at 8 Gemini was also opposed by Pluto from spring 1998 until the end of 1999. This is the last paragraph, these were very appropriate significators for the debate centered around beliefs and values and the proper allocation of resources which had been going on. Also, and I wrote this in the 1990s, there is a death rebirth process going on in Scotland's ties with England and the UK. The outcome of that is by no means clear, many Scots wanting nothing less than the end of the long marriage with the UK. So, the Scotland's midheaven is 9 degrees Aries, the sun is 10 degrees. In fact, that's amazing. Battle of Culloden midheaven is 10 Aries, and Scotland's horoscope, which was basically runs from the 25th of March, 10:05, Culloden's MC and Scotland's MC and Sun are identical. Having all these 12th house planets that really I've found uncomfortable all my life, although I've come to terms with it now, is the mediumistic dimension of it. Because my husband and I visited the Culloden battlefield, probably about 7 or 8 years ago. And we were both in a kind of grumpy, unreceptive mood, and we were tired, and I wasn't particularly wanting to go there. And as soon as we started driving towards the battlefield, I began to get these terrible, terrible feelings of grief and loss. And I couldn't bear to walk around it. It was too difficult for me. And I had completely not expected to have any kind of reaction like that at all. So it just shows you, that the energies of despair and anguish and murder and death and cruelty hang around places, and some people can pick them up, because that's happened to me in more than one place. So, astrology is about looking at the interconnectedness of everything and all the energies that run through time and space, up and down through centuries and all the rest of it. And the more I do astrology, the more I realize how absolutely interconnected at the smallest and the greatest level everything is. And I just find it awesome and really quite difficult to put into appropriate words, really. But I just feel that it's been a huge privilege of my whole life to study astrology and to work with astrology and its symbols. And, I do wonder if I hadn't taken my laundry into that laundrette in Bath in July 1974 and had that experience, whether my life would have taken a totally different path. But that's something I will never know. How on earth do I possibly talk about Mary Shelley in 5 minutes? All I can say is that I was born with the North Node exactly on my midheaven, and that has a 19-degree cycle. The nodes return to their own place 19 degrees. And if you are strongly plugged into any of the planetary cycles, then the return points are deeply, deeply significant and transformative in your life. And that's certainly been the case with me. So when I discovered that Mary Shelley had written Frankenstein when she was 19, I thought, aha, this looks interesting. And then I got her horoscope and I just became completely obsessed with it, because she has the North Node in Gemini in the 12th house, and it's connected in such a way that you can see how she was born to send a particular kind of energy out into the collective, which was possibly prophetic. And what she was saying to us in Frankenstein was, look, I mean, I'm sure most people have either seen the movies or read the book. What she was saying was, look, if we don't practice science with ethics and compassion and awareness of the consequences of our actions, we could cause enormous amounts of trouble. And I think that what happened to Frankenstein and his monster was a wonderful statement of that, which has resonated down through the generations. So Mary Shelley, as it were, issued the challenge to the far future. Watch it, folks. Watch what science, where science may take you, if it's not tempered by the more subtle dimensions of life, which are so meaningful for all of us. And then, of course, young Greta Thunberg appears, and their horoscopes are so connected, particularly through the nodes and through Pluto. And the research I've done on the nodes, particularly in relation to Pluto, I've written this research study called The Moon's Nodes in Action, where I've done case studies, and I've done a long study of Mary Shelley there. But the way in which Greta Thunberg, who is also another young woman emerging from the collective, standing up and saying, look, this is what you need to pay attention to. It's as though she's kind of caught the baton from Mary Shelley. And she is now saying, these are the consequences of what has happened to us as a result of not looking after our planet and disregarding the subtle ways in which everything is connected to everything else. And now we need to do something about it. And the younger generation are going to be the people who will suffer. So we are standing up and telling you, older generation, that we're not going to put up with this. So the Extinction Rebellion movement was born out of that. But if you get the book and look at the essay at the end, the links between Mary Shelley's chart and Greta's chart are just astounding. And also the links between Mary Shelley's chart and Dolly the Sheep, who appeared to the world under the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction of 1997, are astonishing. Because the guy who created Dolly the Sheep, who was a scientist called Dr. Ian Wilmot, was christened in the media and called Dr. Frankenstein. So if you look at all these charts together, you'll see amazing resonances. And I mean, I developed such an obsession with Mary Shelley and her story and her charts that I got to the stage where my students were practically crossing the road when they saw me coming, except at the end of one particular year, they gave me all sorts of memorabilia. They gave me pens with woolly sheep on them and all the rest of it. It was really quite hilarious. So that's a very, very poor snippet of my Mary Shelley obsession. But I think that Mary Shelley was, in her way, a prophet. I really do. I think she was a prophet of the future. And that book that she wrote, which came to her, the plot of it came to her in a waking dream and nightmare. And basically, she just went and wrote it all down. She did that before she was 20 years old, which is just amazing. You can find me online on my website, www.anne-whitaker.com. In fact, I can stick it. Do you want me to stick it in the chat box by way of a goodbye? Okay, here I am. And it may come as no surprise to know that my website is called Writing from the 12th House. And my email address is info@anne-whitaker.com. There we are. I think, yeah, that's it. I've got it right. Okay. There we are. I would love you all to buy my book, by the way. That goes without saying. And I think you would enjoy it because there is such a spectrum of mercurial musing in it. And the feedback I'm getting is that it's of value to both beginners and mature astrologers, that there's something in it for everybody. So there you go. And it would be lovely to hear from any of you if you have the time or the inclination. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been wonderful.